Good morning, everyone. Since we have a bit of content to go through, we'll go ahead and get rolling right into it. So when we're talking quantitative risk management programs, and especially as opposed to qualitative and other aspects around just nuts and bolts risk management, if we boil it all down to sort of our viewpoint on the simplest aspect, it's to make a cogent risk decision, right? Make a higher quality one, make a more accurate one, but not necessarily make the best one. So quantitative is not a panacea or anything like that, but it provides a little bit more data and more elements behind it to help improve that decision-making process. So if we look at quantitative as opposed to qualitative, and we think about what's the status quo, and in general, one of the common problems that we see using qualitative factors is, while it does have its place and it can be used for analyzing a risk in isolation, meaning, hey, this one particular risk is a critical risk, we need to do something about it. When you start looking at it across populations, let's say dozens of risks, hundreds of risks, thousands of risks, or across departments, let's say Department A has a higher critical risk and Department B has a higher critical risk, and which one should we tackle first? How do you prioritize? Are there different contexts to those risks? Do they even mean the same thing in the same department? And so prioritization becomes an issue, sort of normalization becomes an issue, and then it's really hard to track investment decisions on really are they buying down the risk in the way that you expect them or hope they will. So that's where quantitative can come in and help. And as we're talking here, sort of doing quantitative on a budget, and we'll cover things, and Matt will talk about like sort of lightweight mechanisms and other things to sort of get your foot in the door and bring some immediate value. One of the things it really helps provide is sort of normalization, right? Let's take that Department A, you do some modeling, you see there's a probable loss of between 800,000 and $1 million for that year. Department C is a probable loss between 100,000 and 300,000, and then suddenly it's like, all right, now I have a little bit more information to make a more informed decision on how to prioritize. And then you look at it across a portfolio of risks, portfolio of domains, then you can actually do repeatable processes, and using similar data, you can actually use similar modeling and come out with the outcomes to sort of understand, okay, this is how we're sort of normalizing it from a cost-loss basis. And then ideally, you can then track what your investment is, meaning how much risk you buy down with a control over time. So then you can trend what your return on investment is for a control. We'll talk about that a bit later. And for this talk, in particular, we're focusing on sort of FAIR terminology. We're not going to do a deep dive of FAIR or anything like that. You can go to FAIR Institute, learn all you want about it. What's important here is we'll talk about a few things like threat event frequency, threat capability, right? That threat actor skill level you're seeing, what loss magnitudes are, and we'll talk about them in ranges, right? So, anywhere from what low to high and potentially most likely values, things that would go into creating what would be a Monte Carlo analysis of loss. But if you want a deeper dive on FAIR, I highly recommend doing FAIR Institute. So, as you sort of look at, all right, the reasoning why you'd want to potentially delve into quantitative risk, there's a few more elements you'd want to gather before actually sort of looking at building a program or an MVP of it. One is understanding for your company, for your organization, what's the executive leaderships or the boards, or the board risk committee, like what's their strategy around risk? What do they worry about? What keeps them up at night? What's their risk sentiment, different things we'll talk about in a bit, and that focus area. And then you want to look at the culture. Is there already a data-driven culture? Meaning, are they using data to make other decisions? Do they have rigor in how they're capturing things? Meaning, hey, does the IT team always require a ticket and you have good data in the ticket? So from a risk analysis perspective, you have another data source there you can call upon. So understanding those cultural elements are key.
So why do this, right? There has to be a proposition for the business to come and actually want to do this type of engagement. First thing is, being able to drive down risk based on what you're spending. Companies spend billions and millions of dollars, but don't always know necessarily why they're spending it. This enables them to focus some of that area and some of those conversations around risk and have those discussions that are necessary to really attain why we're making those spends. You also can really look at emerging threats. So the moment something comes out, you've got a nice framework, a nice set of information which is aligned to your business, how you do business, and insert the model information about the threats and the information you've collected, and get an actual number to compare two sets of scenarios or what other controls you may need to introduce. And then viability even at the product stage, right? So we talk a little bit, a lot of this will be focused on the IT side of things, but you can do it on the ERM side, right? That's where a lot of this framework works. So you can go in and, hey, we're gonna do X, Y, Z from a product perspective. How is it gonna impact your downstream controls from a security perspective? Or how is it, you could even go to the point of sales and things like that. It's a very expandable framework. But you're going to run into some sharp edges with quantification, right? And that's why probably most of you are here, is that you've run into one of those edges at some point in time. One of the big things is quantitative analysis isn't what your program is, right? It's not just, hey, here's a number, go. There has to be an overarching program and cycle that all this information goes through, just like your risk assessment methodologies, right? Quant is not risk management. It's a way of describing risk. It's a way of presenting risk so that decisions can be made. And then, again, as Tim said earlier, you're not making the quantitative analysis isn't making decisions for you. It's just supplying you the information. Don't let the business see a number and just immediately go make a decision. It has to be a conversation. It has to be a cycle that you go through.
All right, let's go into talking about just instantiating a program a bit and sort of early decisions you need to make. So one of the immediate, what type of program do you want? Right? Do you want to focus on cyber risk? Do you want to focus on a little overarching IT risk or enterprise risk? Highly recommend starting out, first time, cyber risk. It's easy to prove value. It sort of scopes things down to sets of risk scenarios that has data in industry and other things that you can grab onto. So that's where I would lean towards. And then you want to look at team structure, FTE. So think about what can you feasibly tackle given the resources you have. Meaning, instead of, hey, we want to just do the whole thing of cyber risk quantification, we'll say, all right, we want to run the top 20 scenarios, because that's all I have resources for in order to do the research and the risk decomposition for. So deciding on what you have resources you have versus what you want to tackle. And then skills and training, key is understanding, do you have people on your team that can do risk decomposition? Are they good researchers? Are you wanting to go down paths where you're doing some code where, for example, in Python or R? So all these things you want to take into account. And again, like, it's not a high burden on any of this. Like we're going to show later on as far as one of the analysis mechanisms, it's pretty straightforward that in a couple hours, a complete Python novice can do it pretty quickly. And then hiring, and this is more as your program matures, is looking at how you do evaluations for people you want to bring onto the team to make sure you have fit for purpose for doing quant risk analysis.
So the second stage in what we have to do is look at how you're going to do your reporting. Hierarchical reporting and roll-ups are one of the core functions of bringing this information together and really making it useful to the business. So you want to start at your overall kind of strategic risk level. What is important to the business? It can be done based on your departments. A lot of organizations want to roll up by owners and the structure that you've got. That's very easy. You can then choose to do it the other way, which is what's important to your business. So like in our case, or in the case that we have in the example, security, operations, and compliance from a security perspective. Those are the three areas that are important. And then we're going to go and do our
if someone could roll back the slides too, that'd be great. They just sort of skip forward.
So while we're waiting for that, the second tier allows you to pick designated topics within the strategic risk and help you drive the use cases there. I apologize. And then tier 2 is where you get your living risk. It's sometimes what you call a risk register. You know, it's a balancing point with where you are in your organization if this really is a risk register, because the next level down is your actual what we call issues, and they're things like audit findings, security incidents, data management failures, or just things that are reported from the business. So depending on how you want to engage with those risks, that could be your risk register, or your tier 2 can be your kind of tier 2 register. Also, the one other thing to be careful when you're building these structures is determining where you want to do many-to-many relationships and one-to-one relationships. Because each time you create one of those mapped relationships, it drives more complexity into the system. You won't necessarily, you'll get double counting a lot of times what happens. So you have to be very careful as you drive numbers and as you do roll-up information, you're not creating those duplicates. Last thing is, because you have these tiered structures and it's all addition and math and however you're rolling it up, each one of these points can be reported at. So if you have owners or if you have questions at specific areas in the business, you can immediately go to that area if your program's set up correctly and find the numbers you want to pull for it.
And so, like I said before, like that was showing a little bit of an enterprise risk sort of view, but I would take a vertical slice of that starting out. In the case here, we have the tier 0 risk category of security. And one of the fundamentals you need to baseline is your risk capacity, your risk appetite, and your risk tolerance. And those things can mean different things to different people, to different methodologies. Keep them stupid simple here. Risk capacity is just the max amount of loss your company can sustain a year, and otherwise after that, it just doesn't look like the same company anymore, right? It's fundamentally changed. So for here, we said, sit down CFO, let's say, hey, all right, risk capacity, $100 million, right? That's the scale that we're on. And then you can take a look at that and decide, okay, for security, what's our risk sentiment, right? So you could take the capacity of 100 million, and then you could section it off and say like, all right, from a risk sentiment statement, we're risk averse, or we're risk neutral, or risk tolerant, or we're risk seeking, right? Depending on where you land in that. And that can help sort of ease that conversation for folks who aren't really familiar with quantitative means. And we'll say, hey, risk neutral is between $5 and $8 million. And so the security appetite here, we're just going to do a blanket 6% of your risk capacity. And then you might ask, well, how do I get to that 6%? Variety of ways. You can say, okay, let's look at the security budget, or all budget items, both FTEs and tooling and everything else that go to apply to security risk. And then you say, well, that's around 600,000. Well, whether that's where you want to be from a risk sentiment standpoint, that's where you are, right? So that's about the amount of risk you're doing. And you can go up and down from there, but it's a good starting point. And you also look at it from an industry perspective, saying, all right, how much spend is security in relation to revenue? You know, some is at 0.6, is it 1%, is it 2, right? And you can sort of, there's numbers out there on that. But basically you want just some place to start, and that's a good place. And then underneath tier 0, you have tier 1, which is a slew of principal risks. We have one here with data loss, but you'll have more. And I think it's important to note that the appetite is an aggregate value, right? So you roll up all those principal risks, and they'll all have, you know, potential modeling losses, and you say, all right, how much is that roll up against our appetite? And in this case, the tolerance here, and tolerance defined a lot of ways. Keep it, again, very simple. It's at the point at which you have to make a decision whether you're going to accept the risk or if you're going to make an action to mitigate risk, right? It's just a threshold that you can put to make some action against. And when I talk about these losses too, it's important to note, these aren't like revenue. It's not like $600,000 in revenue losses at tolerance. No, it's just 600,000, right? That could be revenue, that could be lost opportunity through people's reallocation of resources to tackle a problem instead of going after the objective of the company. So that's what those losses can build into. And in this case, keep it 10% of appetite. And again, you could look at your budget, other things to see how much of that are you realistically applying to data loss scenarios in this case. And here's just another look from a loss table structure. It's something I adopted from David Vos back in the day. He used this a lot on different things. And this just sort of gives you a sense of where you can put some qualitative mapping, because there's some places where qualitative is still a good reportable mechanism where you don't want to report quantitative. So you have, qualitative things there from nil to catastrophic, and like I said, you could say, oh, okay, extra low and very low are risk averse from a risk seeking standpoint. And so you can have those tables and understand it, and then actually jump into the next one. You can also start setting your alerts based off that and how you want to report, meaning, okay, we have 600,000 in losses against a $6 million appetite. Well, now we're starting to get to medium risk against our appetite, right? And then you could say, oh, we're starting to get to very high risk against our appetite if it's above 3.3 million, right? So you have this ability to still communicate in a very qualitative way for those cases in which you want, but it's extremely backed by quantitative numbers first to help get you there. In the same way with the tolerance, you can look at it and say, okay, we want to alert our risk counsel or risk owners for anything that's within 20% of tolerance. And you can say like, okay, from at very high when things there, or at high, we're going to start alerting. So these are just different mechanisms that you can use to help with that reporting element.
So now you've built an overall structure, a data structure, and a basic framework for what you want to do. You need to choose a tool. This is one of the spaces where you can't just do things on paper, because to be honest, that's going back towards the qualitative side of these types of frameworks, right? So there are a couple of options in the open source world, one of them being PyFair. It's a Python-based solution, very quick, very clean. It gets a little bit more kind of distance in your numbers. You don't always get the same kind of use cases. But it's a great lightweight tool to get started with. The other option is to go towards something like Evaluator. Evaluator is about a 9-year-old application at this point in time. It's written in R, but it's very powerful. I do suggest that if you go towards the Evaluator side, having someone who understands some basics in R is great, because it was built on hardware 9 years ago, and there's some tweaks that you have to make it go considerably faster, because it only runs on one processor as of the current fork. Now, we've gone and forked it, and we'll talk about some of the changes we've made it to it as an open source platform a little bit further on. But the other option are, there are other industry solutions out there. There are people selling them probably out on the expo floor today. Those solutions work for what you need, but you need to make sure they fit your business need as well as the quantitative analysis that you want to run through. So overall, you've now gone and defined your program, you've talked to your leaders, you've done a small MVP and shown them what it can do for them. They've signed up and said yes. The next step is to kind of go in and really solidify the entire life cycle, the methodology. Make sure you've trained all of both your staff and the business. One of the things people forget to do is train the business on what all this means. They need to be able to absorb it and not have knee-jerk reactions to the information you're giving them. So it's important to train them as well. And then focus on what is most prioritized for the company. As we talked about, most of us are not going to get the resources to do quantitative risk analysis across the entire company day one. So pick the areas that you feel you could be most impactful up front, what the business is looking at right now, and drive those first.
Yeah, and it's important, like I said, like don't try to tackle too much. If you're doing a proof of value, again, like you can throw out the risk tolerance and appetite at first. You can just say like, I'm gonna run these risk scenarios based off data I'm getting in order to actually prove out that this is a path we should go on. And a lot of the timeline here is dependent on those cultural questions I sort of mentioned before, because if this is really new or it's not a data-driven culture, then you probably wanna focus a little more on the proof of value stage to really get buy-in before you sort of boil the ocean with everything else. So what's the MVP look like? And this could also, like if you want to differentiate between MVP and a proof of value being a much more sort of vertical slice, smaller sort of thing. The process here is about the same, so you could use either or. But one of the first things is a data feed. You got to have information to run a modeling analysis, right? So, and that can come from a variety of places, right? You can take stuff, reports from Anisa, Scientia, you can do breach reports, you can take all the stuff that's sort of available out there that talks about threat actors, the threat landscape, how skilled they are, losses companies see for different type of threat scenarios, and also internal feeds, like stuff from your SIM, over logging, like anything that internally can help. And that includes even subject matter experts that are calibrated to, which there's some training, and if you want interested in calibration training, recommend, how to manage everything in cybersecurity risk, stuff from Searson and Hubbard, that they talk about like how to calibrate SMEs for like providing good estimates. And those are sound data points you can use. And then you need something that you can capture this information into, right? You need a way of capturing it in order to process it. And we'll talk about rapid risk assessments in a second. And then decomposing the risk. I particularly like for its simplicity, especially for training the executive set, bow tie analysis. So we'll go into that a bit. And then at that point, a decision on, all right, do we want just some quick analysis on this, something like PyFair, or do we want a deeper analysis that gives a lot more depth and detail with Evaluator?
So rapid risk assessments is something Tim just talked about. It's a methodology that you can find out online. What we're going to talk about here is, again, adapted to what we need. Again, using open source tools, using what you're given, and adapting it to your business need. But it's a structured assessment that's quick. It runs about an hour, hour and a half, depending on use case, and it allows you to collect a lot of the information you need to be able to run your analysis. When you start these types of analysis, the first thing you always need to pull together, again, as Tim said, is information. So things that you can do in the quantitative space is work with finance to determine the wages and the revenue for the business. And then look at how revenue influences business decisions or the business in general. Those informations put together will really help you determine some of the loss magnitude information you need later on in the assessment. So make sure that you're focused on gathering the data you need about the threats, the loss magnitudes and those types of things before you go into these assessments. And then just build it simple and repeatable. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. And to be honest, if you overly complicate it, your business probably isn't going to be interested in doing it anyways. So one of the things the rapid risk assessment gives us when we did this is a structure, right? It allows you to remind that you need to collect specific things. In our use case, we decided to collect things like use case catalog, how the data, how that information that we're assessing is being used. An information dictionary, what that information means, so the next time that everyone's talking on the same conversation, the next time someone goes to read this report, they understand what it is. And then these types of information that you're collecting shouldn't just live in these documents. You need to find either a relational database or an industry product or something that you can collect this information so that it can be looked at across the entire portfolio rather than just in this one silo. Because use cases or threats that you find here may be very impactful other places in the business, so it needs to be reusable. And then again, as Tim mentioned, finding some type of visual or structural analysis tool. We love bow tie analysis. It's very easy. It's very consumable by the business. And then once you've done the actual analysis and completed it, make sure you've picked the methodology and you stick with it. You don't want to be bouncing between different methodologies because your business didn't work with this one or that one. Make sure that the framework and the methodology you're using to actually run your quant, like in our example, we are using the Monte Carlo simulations. Find that, stick with it, and go with it.
Yeah, and I'll note on the rapid risk assessments, those came out of Mozilla a long time ago, and you have the RRA Rocks thing there, you can check it out. Note that that's qualitative, like out of the box, so we've adapted it to take in, like the bow tie analysis isn't part of it. So if you want to talk to us specifically about adaptations we did on the rapid risk assessments, just grab us afterwards. So, but focusing on bow tie analysis, so I like this for the executive you want to teach who's not familiar with risk. This is a very easy way of doing it. So basically this comes from background a lot of health and safety world on derivation of this. But it's really simple, right? You have a threat that can cause a threat event that results in a loss, right? So we have an icy road that could cause a car crash that can result in a loss of life. And then you basically have two control types. You have controls that keep the event from happening from a probability standpoint, or you have controls that if the event happens, it lessens the impact of the event, right? So driving slower, studded tires could help prevent a car crash on an icy road, and a seatbelt could help reduce the odds of loss of life. So you can throw in then cyber in that, right? Or pretty much any sort of threat scenario combination. And I think it's important to note, these can get much more complicated. These can be very much a tree structure. For example, you could have one threat cause multiple risk events, right? So you could have multiple risk event boxes underneath this. And vice versa, you could have multiple threat event boxes that cause the one risk event. So you can have a lot more depth here if you want. And you can also pull away from it as well, right? Instead of saying like phishing-driven ransomware specifically, we just say ransomware in general, right? You could elevate it if you want to from a data capture standpoint. So here's where we sort of bake in FAIR a bit to it. So as we have a threat, so we look at the threat capability. And in FAIR, it's a range, right? You have your high, your low, and your most likely values in order to help run your Monte Carlo simulations. And in this case, we're saying, hey, this threat actor is pretty capable, from a percentage standpoint, about 50 to 70%, with a most likely value around 60. If you want to just purely guess most likely, you can take like a mean, if you have no better option, and then use confidence intervals, which Matt will mention in a second. But it could also be, if you're not unsure of the threat actor skill level, okay, you could start at 0.2 to 0.9, right? You can have a wider range if you need to and hone in as you get better data. And then event frequency, very similar. That's more of a count. We have X amount of events per year, from a low to a high to what we think is probably the amount we'll get. And then data loss, same thing with losses, right? From, in this case, 2 million to 10 million, with most likely, if this happens, we have a $4 million loss. And then resistance strength, or AKA control strength, very similar, right? But I like here is also incorporating the capability maturity model on here, so you can actually trend based off control maturity. So for example, this is at a level 2 for employee training. So we're saying it's at that planned and tracked level, which from a resistance standpoint is between a 0.2 and a 0.5. And then this way you can say, if I want to invest in that and say, I want to be CMM level 4 for employee training, then you can sort of really understand investing in a way that increases your control maturity for that aspect. And so it's very similar across that with controls with, you see the next one is more well-defined at a higher sort of resistance rate. And then we take it to something like PyFair, which is very lightweight and extremely easy to use, even for folks who may be a little worried about jumping into Python. This is just installation of Jupyter notebooks and importing the PyFair library and just going to town on here. You'll see in the big text block, you'll see loss magnitude, threat event frequency, threat capability, control strength, with the values put in there, right? And that's pretty much it. It's pretty set as far as like configuration standpoint out of the box, to not be too difficult. And since it's Jupyter notebooks, you can keep notebooks for over time and historical purposes. And then you just run the analysis, which it runs the Monte Carlo analysis, and you get your risk distribution. In this case, you can see the loss exceedance curve and exceedance probability curves, and we're looking at about a likelihood of like 80% that we'll have $100,000 or more loss a year in this particular scenario. So you can take that and say, all right, well, what if I want to look at an investment in a control? So we could add another box, add another details on now looking at what residual risk would be with an investment, and then run it again, and you can have your blue, which was your inherent on there, and then your residual and your orange, and you notice like, hey, that $20,000 bought down 80% of the risk, right? It went from 80% of a $100,000 or more loss to, I think it looks like less than maybe around 10% or so. So, from an investment standpoint, it doesn't make the decision for you, but it just adds a data point for a risk owner to say, okay, now I can make a more cognizant decision around it.
So the secondary method that we went through after starting with PyFair was Evaluator. So it's a very easy system, and it really simplifies input for the business. It's a spreadsheet. They're all used to using spreadsheets. So if you decide to go and actually let them do the work as it matures, it's a great model to start with. It also, because you're just running the engine, allows you to be more flexible within your business, and being open source, you can even be more flexible, which we'll talk about how we went about doing that. And then it'll expand as you want to get bigger and better and do bigger things. It really enables you to do that. Example here is what you see on the top, that first screenshot, is what it comes with out of the box, right? So it has all the loss magnitudes, the control strength that we were talking about. It allows you to map individualized controls against specific scenarios. Great functionality. We matured really quickly to the point where even though it's using qualitative, let me go back a little bit. It's using qualitative frameworks, and in the back end, it converts those to qualitative numbers. So it's kind of a in-between number there, right? So you put in a medium, and in the medium is defined this low, this medium, and this high, and you just change those in a spreadsheet, in a text file. We decided, okay, that's a little too rigid. I went and wrote a text parser, so now we just put the text of what we want for the high, medium, and low, and just separate them with I think I use a colon, right? So that allows you then to process that, put it into the text, and run a full scenario, and you can get the larger numbers and the much more adapted to your business needs. It also comes out of the box with a really, really good, because it's written in R, document generation function. So anything that you can write in R can be immediately adapted right into a document. You don't have to copy and paste. It automatically generates all those things. And these are the examples that what you're seeing on the screen comes right out of the box, right? So you can see, well, let's go to the next one. It has the ability to do things like outlier scenarios, right? So which one of your scenarios has a really, really big number just on this one use case. So that a lot of times you're doing P90s and those get disappeared. You can see some of that information on the graphs that are out of the box. And you can see your fragile scenarios, right? Fragile scenarios being things that you only have one control, and that control may be strong, but if that control goes down, you now have a wide open scenario set, right? So you want to be able to identify those quickly. You also want to be able to look at things like capability strength or control strength and see which ones are weak and where you need to go focus in your business. This, again, right out of the box, right in the initial reporting, nothing you need to change. And then, forgot what this one was. Oh, scenario level loss frequencies, right? So you can really get in and determine some of the higher event losses that are occurring and again, work the business through those things. And any of these things can be adapted very easily with some very simple R changes in R code and almost anybody who has some experience in R or programming, to be honest. When I started this, no experience in R. So it can be really easy to get into. It's not a heavy lift.
Though I still recommend doing PyFair first.
Yes.
It's involved getting into Evaluator initially. So reporting. So you have all this data, you have these modeling, you have some good stuff out of Evaluator if you use it, you have good stuff out of PyFair. So what are sort of the initial things you should look at? Like keeping it simple, right? What's our annual probable losses by percentage? What are our losses against our tolerance and our appetite? What threat scenarios are driving those losses? Which is really important because you also want to be able to say what controls which are addressing those threat scenarios and where they're at and how much they're addressing it, right? So if you have a threat scenario driving a lot of loss, but you have very immature controls with it, it's probably a target for some investment if you're worried about it from a tolerance perspective. And then looking at areas too of identifying control surplus, which you saw with Evaluator there, of basically saying, hey, like we're potentially overspending in this area. Maybe we should reallocate some resources here to address this other area of risk where we need to. And then so one of the things adapted, this is Richard Searson uses and talks about, and I find them very valuable, these risk report cards. The data within them can change. This is a little different than you'll see in some places. But basically here, for example, you have your risk scenario on top. And then you have what's driving that risk scenario, right? The cause, and then you have your controls, the maturity of it, right? And then the big top line thing is, well, what's your ask? Do I need investment in order to reduce the risk here? And if so, what is the investment? And then you have things like control, return on investment. So you can use that sort of differential analysis we showed before of how much risk this control buys down, what's the cost of the control, and then you can get a ROI on that, and then you can track that over time. And then different things like percentage of risk, sort of understanding for this scenario, how much of my overall risk is it consuming? And that can tell you like, hey, 20% and have a high risk number here from an annual loss perspective. then I should probably do something to address this scenario. And then sort of metadata on the bottom for around like what this scenario losses are from a most likely perspective, and then from a P90, which P90s gets more and more important as your program gets mature, because that starts bringing in a few outliers as far as the curve goes, and those become much more important to really wanting to address. Like those are those high impact, low probability outliers that you do want to start being cognizant of as your program matures.
So, okay, we quickly run through so when you got this program running, it's up and running, great. You want to make sure that you make the next step it's really important. So SAS is a great solution, right? So take your framework, present what you're doing, and have another organization show you in their tool how they can do it. Start looking at your deeper insights, diving, rather than staying at top level risks, dive a little bit deeper, pick out specific areas of the business that really need focus and work those through your scenarios. And then better training for your organization so that they can self-service a lot of this. There's no need for a lot of this to be in your hands on a day-to-day basis, or work with them to find the metrics and the information that they have available in their QBRs or whatnot that you can consume and help drive back into the risk analysis.
So yeah, remember, like, quantitative is not a panacea, and there's a lot of people that go on both sides of the house. Like, it just provides you better data points. I think as long as you're following some rigor around it and how you're collecting it and analyzing it, it's going to be a bit better data points for making risk decisions, and that's really as good as you should want to ask for on how you can impact your business and improve it. All right. With that, I think we are done. We might have time for questions.
Open it up to questions. We have about 5 minutes before lunch starts, so we want to get you guys out of here in time for that. Only you can prevent dumpster fires. That's pretty epic. I love that. Thank you, Tim and Matt, so much for your presentation. All right. Question over here.
Super quick question. I think the answer is yes. The loss exceedance curves, all the graphics, do those ship natively with PyFair? Is that something that's already?
Yeah, you would have to rerun the analysis, but they shift on there. Or you can
saying it comes out of the box.
Oh yeah, sorry. That reporting all comes. It comes out of the box.
Those myself. So.
Yeah. So honestly, all the code that I left right there is literally just the PyFair example you get from loading the library. So like you don't really have to do anything initially except plug in your values.
How are you measuring the strength of the control? Are you using this control was listed as a preventive control in an advisory? It's something that the cyber insurance company is now going to check. How are you measuring like the potency of the strength of the control? Or is it just like whether or not you have it implemented?
Right. So I have the benefit of also running the compliance team and other things. So I understand the audit findings. I understand how we're doing on controls. So in truth, it's one taking an honest look of how effective your controls are. So let's take a risk scenario, and you see, like, we haven't seen any events in this. Like, we've seen attempts, but no successes. And then we look at the control of what it looks, across industry, and that gives you sort of a finger in the wind of generally how mature it is. But then you can dive into like an actual audit of the control, whether internal audit or, like we're a FedRAMP platform, so we have a lot of data on effectiveness of controls. And that can help you sort of hone in on how effective that control is for that scenario.
And Tim had talked about maturity models, right? If you're grading all of your controls on a maturity model, it gives you an indicator of where to start, but then you can take the metrics and the experience you have and go from there as well, right?
Oh, and real quick, I should say, you don't necessarily want to control with higher maturity, right? So that you should not be like, I want to move this from a level 2 to a level 3, unless there's a reason to. Because otherwise you might, if it's addressing the risk, it's addressing the risk, and there's no reason to overspend.
We have another question right here.
Hey, Tim, Matt, thanks for the excellent presentation. The question that I have is, you mentioned organizations doing like top 5, 10, or 20 scenario for analysis. What is your current journey as far as like, have you gone beyond just doing those, top 20? Because I feel like often that's the struggle that a lot of organizations have. That's the first question. The second question, if I may, is you gave the example of one-to-many or many relationships, double counting of risks. Are there specific examples you can provide of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to go first?
Yeah. So When we moved into our current platform and our SaaS, the model we wanted to be able to do was to do individual controls against scenarios. So we're actually running right around 20,000 scenarios a month. Now I've written some code to automate that because when Tim told me we were going to do that, I said that was insane. So we've had to do some API coding to make that work, but it's definitely capable. We run about 250 core scenarios, and then based on the controls, it maps out to about 20,000 at that point. Your other question was the second half?
The one-to-many.
Oh, the one-to-many. So if you have an issue that goes both against compliance, but also the operations of that control, when you map those two across, when you have quantitative analysis, you now have that same number in both scenarios. So you need to decide, is it going to be a 50-50 cross-check and you're just going to send it evenly across? That doesn't always work, but not having it mapped means that you don't have that core scenario, but also if you don't do a many-to-many, then you have each one of those, and you've got to maintain two, and you've got to sync them at all times. So it's a really big, important decision on where you make those many-to-many relationships, how you do it, how you manage them.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at those vertical columns on there, right, I have an incident that maps to FedRAMP, but I don't want it to map to any other thing in there because it'll count twice, but it can also map to this other vertical over here, and then you sort of have normalization across with respect to those particular risks.
And some double counting makes sense. It absolutely does. It's the only, based on how the data works, you would end up with we would end up with probably 250,000 scenarios if we were trying to avoid pure double counting. And at that point, managing them is almost impossible. So again, that's why relationships and relationship information is important, because you can then map out controls, and that one control can map to 15 issues. You change it at the control, it changes at the issue, which then changes all the way through. But because you're making those changes through relationships, that's why you've got to run those scenarios so often, because it could change at any point from a core top level, and it needs to flow down through the scenario set.
Sorry, another question. How would you suggest modeling events that have never happened? Modeling the likelihood, I should say.
That is what researching is about, and why I harped on that point. So there's almost zero data on things that have never happened, right? Like if it's truly like never happened, then you're not probably modeling it because you don't know about it, right? So that's where like looking at industry reports, looking at, even if you go to other countries, other languages for their certain governing bodies over there, regulatory reports or what have you, there's usually some data that'll help. But that's also where if there's no data, subject matter expertise, calibration, right? You calibrate their experts, and having been through this, you can hone in on a really relevant data range from expert who's properly calibrated. And you do that enough times with enough experts, you could probably get a sense of what that modeling would be for an unknown.
And at some point, you do have to trust your staff as well. And that's why hiring risk staff who have experience is kind of on the expensive side, right? Because they do need to make some of those decisions at some point. You can't purely always have metrics. If we could, we'd be in insurance. And none of us are, well, hopefully none of you are in insurance. I'm sorry if you are.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if there is one, and then we'll have to wrap. Sorry to be the bad cop.
So for organizations that may be looking to do this and they're much less mature in this area, you have that hierarchical roll-up of risk. How do you prevent having just like a massive data call, a dog pile of everyone just sending in kind of all these things? Have you found ways that are useful to go through that process, especially for organizations that are less mature in this area? Yeah,
so this is where I was saying, like if you really want to start at a proof of value sort of level, just take like the top 20 cyber risk scenarios that are out there, right? That may affect your organization. And then focus on those and the data you need to understand, okay, how skilled is that threat actor for that scenario, right? What kind of events can happen, right? Do the bow tie analysis just on those 20, and then you can do the modeling, and then suddenly, you put together a report that actually has a lot of really good data in order to help sell the organization on going down this path for more types of risks, right? So you don't even have to worry about a hierarchy at first if you want to just focus on, all right, these are the 10 hot topics for the company in cyber. Let's model them and see how we're doing. And here's our security budget, and here's our pretend probable loss, which again, probable, a range, it's not your actual loss. Can't emphasize that enough, and people sort of lose. It's like, so I always try to give ranges even though we have most likely values, because people sort of take that as, oh, that's an actual, but no, right? You can model it that way, and that's the route I would go to keep it sort of very simple and straightforward and use the least amount of resources to do.
The one thing last I'll add is the fork I kept talking about in Evaluator. We are going to work towards releasing that. We just have to talk to the original owner and see how he wants to deal with it being released. So if you find me on LinkedIn, once it's released, I'll go ahead and post to my LinkedIn so you guys will be able to get access to that repository. We want to make it reusable. It's not much different. It's just some code that I have, like, we went quantitative, so we have a lot of work to do, but I have a little bit of uncoding to do from an IDME specific perspective. So that fork will become hopefully available in the next 3 months or so.